So this part of the Sermon of the Mount is a kind of famous TED talk that Jesus gave. And it's a conclusion, section we're looking at, a conclusion to that sermon. And Jesus does 4 different themes to illustrate, 4 different pictures or illustrations to demonstrate a similar theme. Each illustration, the listener or reader is given the choice between what is true and what brings life, and what is false and leads to destruction. I just wonder if we pause at this moment and just reflect on what we've heard, the theme coming through this service about death and life. We have a comparison between which gate, the narrow or the wide gate. Which prophet, the true or the false prophets? Which disciple will we be, the true or the false disciple? And then finally, the wise and the foolish builders. What foundations are we going to build on? This sermon then ends with 2 verses that are an observation about the reaction of the crowd to Jesus' teaching. So now I'm just going to invite Martin, who's going to come up and read this from the Bible.
Thank you. The narrow and wide gate. So which gate? Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. True and false prophets. Which prophet? Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. True and false disciples, which disciple are we? Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. The wise and foolish builders, what foundation are we building on? Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, and we're familiar with that. And the streams rose, and the winds blew. We're familiar with that, and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And then the response of the crowds. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Thank you, Martin. So we're going to look at those different pictures, the wide and the narrow gates. Jesus said that the way of truth leads to life. It's narrow and few enter this way. And this is the way of righteousness, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. The way of falsehood leads to destruction, on the other hand. It's broad. Jesus said it's the way that most people go, including many of us that would say we follow Jesus. So that's quite a challenging statement Jesus makes to the crowd, that many of them would choose the wide instead of the narrow gate. If Jesus was speaking to me in my heart, I wonder what he would say looking at my heart. If you're wondering about the picture that we've got up here about which gate, I thought of this cattle gate. Imagine you're a sheep, quite low down, looking through the cattle gate. It's a sheep's eye view. Which would look to you like the best way to go? The wide open space. But if you tried to take that path, it would lead to destruction. You'd fall down through that gratings. What is needed is patience. Your best to wait for someone to open that narrow gate for you. Hearing, as we have done over the last number of weeks, the Sermon on the Mount, I suggest that that someone we need to be waiting for is Jesus. I wonder if you've heard that expression, following the crowd. Is that familiar? Yeah, following the crowd. I want to take you back to 1993, just over 30 years ago, and that was when I moved countries. I moved from Kenya to England, and it was about then that there was an item of clothing called a shell suit that was very popular in the fashion. It was kind of like the 80s or 90s trend. If you're into trends now, it might be like your Nike Tech tracksuit, but it looked far, far worse. I don't have a picture of me wearing it, so what I did was I found a picture of online. If you're a football fan and you watch Match of the Day, you may remember the England team from the 90s. There you go, there's Gary Lineker. Looking at him now in the middle, you'd think he's a man of good taste. But however, like me, he succumbed to the shell suit. This is a picture from the Littlewoods catalogue in 1992. Even he followed the crowd. Now, looking back on that may make us smile. Many of us, though, may look back on things we've done in the past, a little embarrassed by the choices we made when we followed the crowd. Now, there's a magazine, it's also online, called Psychology Today. It affirms this. It's a natural human tendency to copy other people's behaviors. And it appears to offer protection. It may even improve our reputation. But herding may have serious consequences, including physical danger to oneself or others, which is why it's crucial to ask questions of others' behaviors before we adopt their views or copy their choices. So now I'm going to share a little bit more significant example of following the crowd. It's relating to mistakes that I made when I was younger, drinking alcohol in the culture of rugby, which is a sport I used to play. So take you back a few years, not that many, of course. When I was younger, I could run fast. As a 16-year-old, I was playing a couple of years up in the 18-year-olds team in a game called Rugby Sevens. And what would happen is after tournaments, they'd take me to the pub with them. It seems a bit strange saying this now, what I'm just about to say, because I don't know what other people spent their paper round money on, but I was spending it on beer. I didn't really think about what Jesus would have said about that. I was focused on living the life. My challenge was getting past the bouncers so I could try my luck at getting served at the bar. And I'm not proud of this, and I wouldn't recommend it. But that kind of trail that was laid at that point carried on as I left home a few years later. I went to study in another city. I was still playing rugby. In fact, rugby was going well. I'd had a few breaks in the teams that I got selected for. And each week, I got to go to church on Sundays. At the same time, after every match on a Wednesday, I was happy to go out drinking with the boys. I would do things for a laugh. I'd go after girls that my mates thought were good looking. But every morning after a night out, if I'd had too much to drink, I woke up not only with a headache, I may still have some stories that might please the crowd, but deep down, I was living with a regret of living a double life. I didn't treat others, especially women, in the way that I knew was honoring of God or honoring of them. I had 2 years or thereabouts living this way, in this tension. And then what happened was I made a decision. I intentionally decided to move rugby club and start afresh. I stopped drinking alcohol and I turned to drink soft drinks. And I did that for a number of years because it was simple to just avoid the temptation altogether at all. A number of my friends at the time, they didn't like it. They were like, oh, where's the old Josh gone? But it was a start of something significant in my life. I was prepared to follow God, whatever the cost. I wanted him to help me walk through that narrow gate in that area of my life. And because of that, I started to reap the harder but longer-term benefits of becoming more trustworthy. My integrity grew, and I had much, much, much more internal peace. Now, there's a book which is in my bag. I wonder if, Carolyn, you could pass. There's a book and a little booklet as well. The book is called The Narrow Path, this one here. How the subversive way of Jesus satisfies our souls. This book contains reflections and teachings of Jesus found on the Sermon on the Mount. We've been passing it round as a teaching team, those of us giving talks in the series. And as I've been reading Matthew's chapter 5, 6, and 7, as we've been doing this, I've been reminded again how countercultural some of these teachings really are. And Rich Villodas puts it into words brilliantly. He says this: what the world prizes, Jesus devalues. What Jesus applauds, the world rejects. In our culture, the word narrow is negative. It means close-minded, stubborn. But Jesus says this more difficult path leads to life. Although narrow may seem more restrictive, hidden within the path is unimaginable power. This path is charmed, so to speak, with an ever-expanding life of God. Experience tells us that things that matter most never come easy. The greater the demand, the deeper the payoff. The greater the challenge, the more joy we get when we overcome it. The more we die to ourselves, the more we become alive in Jesus. And this is the paradox of the Jesus way. It's worth climbing that mountain and entering the narrow gate. If you're looking for guidance about how to walk through that narrow gate and that path, we'd highly recommend this book. Now, the next 3 illustrations we're going to group together. They're comparisons between true and false prophets, true and false disciples, and then Jesus invites us to consider the impact of building our lives on stronger or weaker foundations. True prophets are recognized by the good fruit they produce. Those who listen to them put into action what they hear. They become true disciples who live their lives and their faith on the strong and solid rock of Jesus. That is true wisdom. However, false prophets are recognized by the bad fruit they produce. Those who listen to them may appear to make quick progress. The house goes up quickly without foundations. But, as we heard in the reading, when the storms of life come, their lives fall down with an almighty crash, like the house built on the sand. That is foolish. These are the false disciples, and Jesus will disown them, even if in their lifetime they claimed to follow him. And this is what Jesus then comes to, an invitation. Are we going to follow that way of the wise through the narrow gate that leads to life and build on firm foundations? Or will we take that well-trodden path and follow the way of fools, building a house on sand that's destined for destruction? I wonder, what will our legacy be? Truth is, only time will tell. I wondered in this moment when I was considering this, thinking about leaders, world leaders. In any given moment, those world leaders may have a fantastic following. They may be popular now, but I wonder in years to come, what will their long-term fruit be? What will their legacy be? Now here is an illustration of the G8 leaders. These are world leaders in May 2012. So now we're 12 years on from that time. Some are still in power, some are not. And as time passes by, we often get to see the fruit of what they did, the impact of their decision. Why don't we take a moment to read some of those names? Obama, Sarkozy, Merkel, Monti, Noda, Putin, Cameron, Harper. For some of us, these names won't mean much to us, and that's okay. But if we look them up, we will soon find out things that are written about them, about their fruit, about their impact, about their leadership, about their legacy. And this is the word of warning that Jesus gives. He says, don't be surprised if a false prophet or a false disciple seems to live an attractive life that easily gathers a following. We need to be aware that what in the short term may give us gratification may not actually lead to good fruit in the long term. We may see this in popular politics, even within the church circles, popular modern-day Christian prophets. We'd do well to listen to the words of Isaiah in the Bible, chapter 30, verses 9 to 11. It won't be on your screens, but this is what Isaiah said when he made a judgment about the culture of that time. For these are rebellious people, deceitful children, Children unwilling to listen to the Lord's instructions. They say to their seers, another word for fortune tellers, see no more visions, and to the prophets, give us no more visions of what is right. Tell us pleasant things. Prophesy illusions. Leave this way, get off this path. Stop confronting us with the Holy One of Israel. God's ways are not always popular. That's why Jesus says, the way is narrow. Few find it. And to illustrate this, I want to show this next slide, which is a summary of different phrases in this book that I mentioned. So here we have the world's kingdom values, which are power, wealth, superficial visions of success, which at best equals superficial and fragile happiness. God's kingdom values, on the other hand, values generosity over selfishness, blessing over cursing, truth-telling and simplicity of speech over slurring or slandering. This promises to lead us to freedom, to wholeness, to peace, and to joy that no one can ever, ever, ever take away. One of the things that Jesus says to the Pharisees, we may look good on the outside, but in our hearts, our motives could be all wrong. Yesterday, actually, at home, we were reading about this in Matthew chapter 23 with our children, and they said, Jesus was roasting the Pharisees. That's the kids' language for having a go at them. He was roasting them. Now, Jesus was saying, woe to the Pharisees. You are like cups clean on the outside, but dirty on the inside, like whitewashed tombs. You look clean and neat on the outside, but are full of death, hypocrisy, and wickedness on the inside. The worry for our human hearts is that this is the easier way to be. There's all of this in me. Power, wealth, wanting quick fame is tempting us all as humans, as we love to be popular, successful in the eyes of others around us. But Jesus says it's the eyes of the Lord that count. God is not concerned about what other people think. As was said by God to the prophet Samuel when anointing the future King David in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, the Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The founding leader of the group of churches we're part of, the Vineyard Movement, John Wimber, would say this. He said, when looking for a worship leader, I first look for character, not gifting. It's our character that is important. I wonder when we consider Jesus' invitation. This past week, which gate have I chosen? What prophet or disciple have I been? What foundation am I building my life on? We can be honest here. This is what hope is all about. We're family. We can say this week it's not been great. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes less so. But I am committed to following this adventure with Jesus. As Ryan shared last week, Jesus' teachings are an example for us. It leads us in the way of life. And God's metric is grace. The most important demonstration that we can give that we love God is a commitment to love others. In this book, there's a beautiful explanation that says this: loving God and loving others may appear like two separate things, but in fact, they're one commandment. There are two elements, and those two elements are inseparable. We can't love God unless we love others also, and through loving others, we love God. In Jesus' words in verse 24, which is the part where just beginning the wise and foolish builder, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise person who built their house on the rock, and that rock is Jesus. So, in thinking about how Jesus ends this passage, this talk, this sermon, that's what he does. He comes and ends in that way. Now let's look at the crowd's reaction. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teachings. Because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. That was their response to the Sermon of the Mount. They could hear, see, and experience his power. In fact, the next couple of chapters go on to show he demonstrated his powers with the miracles that he then was performing. They knew he was different to their teachers. Maybe he was God's special son, come to save God's humankind. I wonder if we were there, what would our response be? Now, we're going to show a picture in a moment. 18 months ago, Katie and I had the incredible opportunity and privilege to visit the ancient lands of the Bible in modern-day Israel and Palestine. We literally walked in the footsteps of Jesus. There was one day where we drove around the Sea of Galilee. It's also called the Lake Gennesaret in Luke. We went to the Mount of the Sermon on the Mount, where there's now a church standing, and it's called the Mount of Beatitudes. That's how the Sermon on the Mount starts. It's called the Beatitudes. Blessed are. Here's a picture that I took of the mount from the lake. While we were sat up on the mount, I read Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, which is the Sermon of the Mount. It was a profound experience. These words came alive as I was hearing them in the place where they would have been heard by the crowd for the very first time. The crowds were amazed by his authority. What would my response be? I want to be honest, strangely in that moment, I became aware of this tension. I thought, how easy would it be to enter through that wide gate, to become a false prophet, a false disciple, a foolish builder? But then I realized Jesus' words seemed even more true now, and to me at that point, than they ever had done before. I was deeply convinced that the way of Jesus shows us how to live our lives with peace and everlasting joy. There are heroes of the faith that we can gain inspiration from. And that can be something that we stand on today. And I wanted to share snippets of the story of someone that really inspired me recently as I was reading this little book. It's all about someone called William Booth. And this past couple of weeks, I've been reading it with my daughter. This picture shows you William and Catherine Booth. They began a movement known as the Salvation Army. Katie mentioned in the notices. That's the group that we're hosting here to do the Christmas present appeal. William Booth, he preached outside in pubs. He's preached inside in tents. He preached in the open air in various places. The response was this at first. People jeered at him. They shouted at him. Some of the crowds pelted him with rotten eggs. He was pushed. His clothes were torn. Sometimes he was struck by a stone or a stick. But he always got up and went on preaching. The work was difficult at first, and only a few people accepted his message. At the end of 12 months, there were 60 people helping him. And in his lifetime, the Salvation Army grew to have significant impact worldwide. He was traveling internationally. He was preaching and serving the poor. Now, at the age of 60, though, a terrible blow happened. After 2 years of illness, his wife, Catherine, died. In the Salvation Army words, they say she was promoted to glory. I wonder how William Booth would respond. When his wife was buried, Booth made this promise that he would go on spending all his days and hours serving Christ. He felt freer to travel and to see the Salvation Army work in other countries, which numbered 26 at the time. And he pledged to continue to fight to the very end. He even lost sight in both eyes, and he was still preaching and encouraging and talking to people to encourage them to pursue what God had for them. This is an example, which was what he said as he was dying to his son, Bramwell. I want you to do more for the homeless of the world. And if you don't, I'll come back and haunt you. 40,000 people came back to pay their respects at his funeral. And without anyone knowing, Queen Mary came as well. And she sat next to a poorly dressed woman. And the Queen asked her, "Why did you come to the service?" And she said, "Well, he cared for the likes of us." Now that is the way of Jesus. Rich Velodes talks about this. He says, Jesus chose a narrow path that deprived him of food, it deprived him of power and approval, It even cost him his life, at least for a time. And that is the model that we have to follow. And Rich goes on to give 6 tips for putting this teaching into practice. Meditate on Jesus' teachings. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. Speak truthfully. Pray for our enemies. Offer silent generosity. Surrender anxiety. The message of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is that God's kingdom leads to life. It's a firm foundation. It will stand the test of time. But living like this comes at a cost. The famous German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer says this: when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Here are the words of Jesus in John chapter 12, verse 24 to 26. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. And that's a beautiful promise, that whatever we're going through, if we choose that narrow gate, that narrow path, our Father will honor, as Jesus says, the one who serves Jesus. So why don't we now come back to the original invitation from Jesus? Which way are we going to follow? Which gate will we choose? Which prophet will we become or follow? Which disciple will we be? And what foundation are we building our lives on? Just as we come into land, on a personal level, I'm so thankful that God has placed me in this church full of people here that love me, are praying for me, are helping me to enter through this narrow gate and to walk the narrow path. And my prayer is that we all will enter that narrow gate together. We will also invite others into this beautiful way of life where we discover freedom, wholeness, peace, and joy that no one can ever take away. And that is the way of Jesus. Amen.